First of all, I think it's important just to recognise maybe a few basics from a practice perspective. I think that it's really important to recognise that our work continues to be really important, that our work continues to be very valuable, and that what you're doing, I think, is to a very high standard. So I think that that's a good starting point, because sometimes when we begin to talk about practice and innovation, we kind of, our starting point might be it's not working. I think the sector that is this sector in this context, I think, is doing very well. And there's two kind of, if you like, characters to that story that I just want to start by recognizing before moving on to some of the more substantive points. Number one is idea. So I don't think we should take idea for granted. I think under the leadership of Frank and the team, they've done huge work over the last number of years, not just withstanding COVID, but I definitely think they've been hugely influential in terms of practice and innovation. And the other, I think, gets less oxygen than even recognising idea, and that's the role of Irish Aid. And again, I suppose there's always the danger that when we talk about funders and supporters that we can look to the dark side. But I think we can't assume or take for granted the support that we've collectively, or in the case of Development Perspectives and SAILTA, we can't assume that support is always going to be there. And I think both of those roles, both of those characters in our collective story need recognition, because things could change. And the future is unwritten, and of course, yeah, we all play a part in writing that future, and we encourage those that we engage with to enter that in a development approach. But I do think that we need to be looking at horizons and thinking about these different stakeholders and the role that they've played in the direction that we've come collectively. There's 4 points, I think, just that are very much connected around innovation and practice. I was on a call yesterday that was organised by DOCUS, a guy who wrote a book called Impact Networks, David Ehrlichman. And I was struck by, I suppose, an awful lot of what development education or global citizenship education does very well. But I certainly think that we could do a little bit more around the ecosystem of innovation that we co-produce. I think that it's something that we could look at as a sector a little bit more. There are examples in other parts of activity that do it very well. And I would encourage the sector to look at it a little bit more seriously. It looks very much at relationships and building trust, which we say is at the core of our work. But then how often do we work across organisations? And how often do we cross boundaries that are sometimes artificially put there? How often do we work with partners from different parts of the world, maybe that we're unfamiliar with? So I just think we need to keep an eye on that ecosystem of innovation, and I think there's a lot that we could do to nourish it. One concrete suggestion around that is a call to our, I suppose, bigger international NGOs to maybe do some of what the likes of Trócaire and Goal have done, Trócaire and Concern, no disrespect to Goal. But I definitely think that Concern and Trócaire have played a key part in nurturing smaller organisations, and I actually mean explicitly financially. And I think that there's a role for some of those bigger organisations to look at where innovation is happening, and to kind of wrap some bubble wrap around them with the idea that they can make mistakes, they can risk things, but sometimes they're of a scale where they can't really, whereas some of the bigger organisations can play a key role in that. So I think that's an interesting area. Partnership, I think, is very much linked to this. I know in my case, in Development Perspectives, SAILTA and the strategic partnership that's involved in that has been very influential in my thinking over the last couple of years, but also working with other organisations like EirGrid. So Development Perspectives co-chairs and co-facilitates 2 community forums for EirGrid in different parts of the country. And the reason I mention that is that all of you have skills to do the same. And the reason that I mention that is because there's a huge amount of funding available now from EirGrid for the skill sets that you all have in the room. But I don't know if they know who you are. And I think sometimes when we talk about diversity of funding and what we do, it doesn't have to be through regular giving schemes, but that we can look at our skill sets within our organisations and see how we could work with other partners that can then hopefully enable us to use some of that funding or investment and look at other parts of our organisation that need support. And if you equate it, what's available in the next couple of years from EirGrid, well, to build one small pipeline might cost close to 100 million euros. They have to spend 1% of every pipeline on a community benefit strategy. And in their new community benefit strategy, every single euro that they spend has to be spent on achievement of the SDGs. So I think that that's a possibility for the likes of EirGrid. But it's only an illustrative example. We've worked with Fieldfisher in the last year, again, a private sector entity that funded a piece of work that was very specific, looking at amplifying voices of those that were either programme refugees or in direct provision centres. They were very clear on what they wanted. They funded it, and then they just let us get on with the work. But the reason I mention it is that I do think that partnerships offer us a really good opportunity to look at ways in which we can work a little bit differently, which ties into the area of innovation. Thirdly, I think impact. I was delighted to hear Frank mention earlier on the role of impact. And I know sometimes this can become a kind of an area people don't want to go towards. But I think one area that I would suggest that we do need to become better at collectively is articulating the vision of the future that we want to see, which is great. But then I do think we need to take seriously that grappling that needs to be done around how well or not are we doing around impact. In 2011, I was lucky enough to play a role in a quality and impact seminar that was organised in a summer school in Finland. And I think we can chart from there as an example that the discussions around quality have improved exponentially. I don't think the discussions around impact have moved that much at all. I think it's an area that we need to look at far more seriously collectively, and that's not trying to go back to the OECD and some of the pressures that would be from external actors, but it's more about us as practitioners. Is what we're doing working at a collective level? What are we contributing to? And I don't think that any one organisation can do that on its own, and I think it would be really valuable at a sectoral level with IDEA, with Irish Aid, and collectively with all of us together to really look at that a little bit more. And maybe just a last point around media. I think it's an interesting one that oftentimes with our stories, and I'm always delighted to hear stories being used as a kind of way of working, but oftentimes we look to the media as a channel of us getting our stories to another entity. So they're the kind of communication channel. And I would argue that it's about time that we look at that as a distinct target group. Because when we look at the standard of media in Ireland, I don't think it's at the same standard that it could or should be. And I think that there's worrying trends around the values and norms that are triggered through the media that we digest, whether that be through mainstream TV, mainstream radio, or indeed, the likes of, say, more in the social media end of things and everything in between, print newspapers and the like. The stories shared today shape tomorrow. And the stories shared today aren't great. And I think we need to realise that as a group of very skilled practitioners, if we know the importance of values and frames, then what's in our headlines on a day-to-day basis should give us real cause for concern. Because Audrey mentioned earlier on that there are futures, of course, but those futures are being written by lots of other actors outside of ourselves. And we can see the direction that that's going. And, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that there's an awful lot of polarisation, but not just in England and the UK, not just in the United States, but in Ireland as well. And I think if we're ignoring that, it goes back to one of the considerations given to us earlier on this morning. It becomes maybe a bias or a blind spot. Oh, surely not here. Surely this housing thing isn't because of a collective amnesia or something. That there are real problems, and I think if we collectively ignore them, the real damaging impact is not just to be felt by those who are experiencing it now, but what it could lead to in the future. So I think we need to be really vigilant and at the same time be really kind of honest with ourselves that we're doing the best we can. Thank you.